everyone, and welcome to this episode of Machines in Medicine, a podcast from Syntagon. I'm your host, Dr. Laura Moody. Today we're talking about sustainability, what it is, why it matters, and what the pharma industry, both manufacturers and suppliers to the industry, are doing about it. With me to talk about sustainability is Christian Lavarreda. Christian is the Global Product Manager for Pure Media, Process, and Bioprocess Systems at Syntagon. During his 7 years with the company, Christian has used his expertise to connect customer needs to Syntagon's capabilities across multiple pharma equipment portfolios. Formerly trained as a chemical engineer, Christian also has a background in inhalable drug product development, where he spent 12 years leading R&D and commercialization activities of analytical instrumentation for the delivered dose uniformity and particle size characterization of dry powder, metered dose, nebulizer, and nasal inhalers. Welcome, Christian. I'm so happy to have you on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Laura. It's great to be with you.
So let's start broad. So on a very high level, what topics do you immediately think of when you hear the word sustainability?
I think what I and perhaps a lot of your listeners think first about is environmental sustainability. That's one of the very hot topics. Although also very important, of course, is economic and social sustainability.
Great. Now, I've heard the acronym ESG thrown around a lot. Can we talk a little bit about ESG for our listeners who may not be familiar with environmental, social, and corporate governance? Can you give us a primer?
Sure. So ESG is a way for corporations to organize their sustainability initiatives in. So there's a need to establish benchmarks and to be able to compare each other and then also to track progress. And for that, you need to have some clearly defined categories of initiatives that you're undertaking, and that is how corporations now have standardized their reporting on. So in a way, it's equally applicable to individuals and societies. At those levels, sustainability is equally relevant in its own way, but it's the particular corporate lingo for addressing sustainability.
That's great. Thank you. I think that gets us all on the same page here as we start talking a bit more in depth about sustainability. Now, as a global company working in a global industry, it's important to think about how our actions have a worldwide impact. The United Nations has outlined sustainable development goals, one of which is ensuring access to medicine for underserved populations around the globe, while also continuing to create a more sustainable manufacturing process. Do you think it's possible to do both of those things? And if so, how?
Yes, I think it is possible because I'm not sure that these two things are mutually exclusive. So for access, you really need to have more of an economic and a political resolve on the part of nations that supply different aspects of the healthcare to make those medicines or medical services accessible to populations. It's really mostly about a decision on profitability for pharmaceutical operations and who shoulders the cost of the provision of those services. That is really regardless of the efficiency with which you can make those medicines. So yes, if you can have highly sustainable operations that will drive efficiencies and reduce cost, and that in theory makes it easier to have wider distribution of those products. But I don't think it's a direct outcome of more sustainable and efficient operations. But it certainly helps. I think the industry is thinking a lot about, well, if different underserved countries have regional manufacturing, then they can be more self-sufficient and perhaps better covered with the medicines that are produced locally. That is certainly one of the things that we saw in the response of the pandemic with the major suppliers of really most major vaccines decided to implement to one extent or another a regional manufacturing and distribution strategy. So you saw mRNA vaccines, viral vector-based vaccines, protein-based vaccines, all made all over the world, including in many developing countries, with that aim. And the buzzword there was the democratization of the supply chain of medicine and how that was going to help access.
And the way that at least the mRNA vaccines were manufactured, it was a lot easier to do that in small pods, manufacturing pods throughout the world, instead of more traditional vaccines where you needed, I don't know, millions of eggs and a much more dedicated infrastructure to create the vaccines. So we're seeing changes in the way that we manufacture vaccines that lead into a way to make it a little bit easier to do this manufacturing in a more diversified manner.
Yes. What was actually sad about the actual outcome of that diversification in manufacturing is that by the time that many of these operations were up and running in these regions, demand had waned to the point where very little of that production actually had a market locally, which really puts into question the whole concept, because if you can't establish manufacturing fast enough when demand actually is there, then you could miss the boat, as you saw. And something else that played a role, of course, during the pandemic is the bottlenecks in the supply chain. And I guess you can only say, nationalistic restrictions on exports of important ingredients and materials. That, of course, didn't allow corporations and countries that had their own manufacturing initiatives in developing countries to leverage their facilities, because then they could also not get the inputs that they needed to manufacture the drugs. That's why I see it really more as an economic and political question, because yes, you should focus on efficiency and sustainable manufacturing to bring the cost of goods down. But once you have reached that, then I think you just need a particular willingness to supply many countries with affordable products. And I guess 2 weeks ago, Pfizer was in the news that they are expanding the access to their portfolio worldwide to all, I think, 85 developing countries, where they will be supplying their entire product portfolio of branded drugs at cost. That's really what you need to see for achieving success in meeting patient demand in these countries. If a few more suppliers did what Pfizer just did, that's going to go a long way. Not so much trying to set up a factory for every type of medicine type everywhere. That is a little bit too complicated.
That was amazing to see that Pfizer made that stride, a groundbreaking stride to serve the global population with their life-saving medicines. Hopefully we see more of that in the future from other manufacturers. Now, I'd like to fully shift gears here into the nitty-gritty of pharmaceutical manufacturing. When I think of sustainability in a pharma setting, my first red flag is waste generation, particularly trash that's generated by single-use materials, either during the manufacturing process itself or in the packaging of the drug product, like, for example, an auto-injector. How is the industry addressing the increased adoption of single-use technologies?
That's a very good question, and a question that has been dealt with for quite a while now. Of course, consumables, single-use components have been around in pharmaceutical processing for a very long time, starting with filtration units in downstream processing, really since the advent of modern biotechnology in the 80s. But where it really took off was with the introduction of the wave bioreactor at the beginning of the century. That's when companies really started to realize, okay, we're not only going to be talking about filters and a few connectors and some tubing. Really, the core of our operations could be going single use now. And there I would refer any interested listeners that really want to go deep on this. There's really two companies that hand in hand really laid out the thinking about recyclability of single-use components in pharma, and that's Genentech, the first adopter of the wave bioreactor. So in the mid 2000s, first decade of the century, when they started to implement these bioreactors, they commissioned a wide-ranging study on implications for their sites in implementing wave bioreactors on a large scale. And that was done jointly with GE Healthcare at the time, the manufacturer, and they produced two seminal papers later that decade really trying to do for the very first time what is now called a life cycle analysis of these products. And they're thinking, okay, once I have the bag, what do I do with it and what are the implications? Mm-hmm. But looking at the entire life cycle. So from the resource extraction to make the polymer, right? So making all this additional plastic, you can't ignore the inputs that are needed for that as well. The processing for making the plastic, the extrusion of the plastic, that additional operation, to the manufacturing as well, assembly of the components, and then the recyclability, the big topic. So they studied that in conjunction with the energy intensity of each one of those operations. And they did something very unique at the time. They said, okay, where do we have factories and what is their footprint in terms of energy intensity and how green the operations are? And then what is the implication on what they can do with that plastic then? And what is the impact that plastic does? And they found that there is a very strong correlation, very strong relationship between the magnitude of the negative effect of processing this plastic and the degree to which the electrical grid in those locations is clean or not. In a way that was very disheartening, because it means that if you are operating with a dirty grid, there's always something you can do, but at the end of the day, it's going to have a very large negative effect on the climate. If you're plugged into a dirty grid, if you're plugged into a clean grid, then you can really start thinking about running an almost circular economy where you can recycle most of the inputs and get the most out of I would say byproduct outputs from those processes where byproducts can also be sold as inputs for other industries and so forth.
That's a clever way to reuse, recycle all of the
exactly.
waste. Yeah, I like
that. Exactly. And the question, of course, that pops in people's head a lot is, well, so, I mean, what's the big deal? I mean, isn't plastics almost 100% recyclable? And isn't this highly uniform resin that is used on these? So what's the deal? Well, the problem is that the washing procedures that you need to get the plastic to a certain purity grade is typically prohibitive, depending on the geometry of the material and how much processing you would need to do to the material. And then you need to wash that material before you can recycle it. And the question is, what do you do without water? And if that water poses biohazard in some way or contains traces of what would be then considered toxic substances, even if it is just bioactive materials that are, in some cases, part of the active pharmaceutical ingredients, in other cases are just excipients, but you can't just have that runoff go into regular water. And if you have to do that much treatment, then the return on investment on a recycling operation goes down significantly. So your listeners might be surprised to hear that although it is possible, the vast majority of single-use components are incinerated. And you can do smart incineration in a sense that the heat and the gases that are produced from incineration are used for generating additional electricity that can feed your plant or the local community where your factory is. But you can't do anything about the carbon emissions in that case. Once you're burning that plastic, then you're releasing those emissions, and then also other noxious gases. It's not just carbon dioxide. So it's a tricky question that the industry is really trying to contend with. Lots of new studies have shown that for high cyclability facilities where they're turning around those 2, 3, 4, 5,000 liter fermenters fairly often, batches running fairly often, that depending on where you are, it actually is more environmentally friendly to still have the traditional stainless steel configuration where you do, essentially cleaning and sterilizing in place before every batch, which is a very high water consumption and also high electricity consumption, which takes a toll on the climate as well, but not as much as the incineration. So that's the balance that customers are trying to strike.
Well, I have no doubt with the amount of brain power in our industry that there will be some strides made in sustainability of plastic, single-use components in the future. Maybe not tomorrow, but the future is bright. So you had just talked about consumption. Let's talk a little bit more in depth about energy consumption. So many pharma manufacturing sites work 3 shifts. They burn the midnight oil to get medicines to the people who need them. Are there opportunities to be more energy efficient in the processing of their plants? And if so, what are they?
Yeah, in my opinion, the answer there is a resounding yes. And the challenge is, how do you find out what the potential return on certain improvement measures are for your plant? What we typically find is many facilities don't really understand what measures they could take and what impact that would have overall. And there are companies that specialize now in helping companies assess what is the setup of their infrastructure, and what measures could be undertaken with what level of effort. One of the companies that's out there promoting this, not to have a plug-in, there's no conflict, no conflict of interest to declare there, but there's a branch of Ecolab called Nalco Water, and they'll go to pharmaceutical sites and do basically a whole lifecycle inventory of all inputs and all outputs of those plants, and then make recommendations. And I was very, very surprised to hear that for an average size plant, it's an assessment that typically takes less than a week. The same thing, a few technicians for less than a week, and they can really characterize the plant for a client. And then at that point, then the client can really make an informed decision. I think a lot of plants basically think that it's a daunting task to even begin taking the first steps, because they really don't know where to start. And what is becoming clear is that getting started is actually not that hard, with help with some of these professionals that specialize in this.
So it seems like there are opportunities to invest in sustainability strategies or increasing the efficiency across the pharma manufacturing cycle, but that seems expensive. So beyond just being good for our planet, would pharma manufacturers actually want to go this route to then produce positive outcomes to the bottom line for their manufacturing strategy?
Yes, certainly a good part of the recommendations that facilities might get from the experts evaluating their particular situation would involve capital expenditures that might be difficult to justify and to get approved. But most customers would get surprised at how many also much easier so-called low-hanging fruit can be identified through these assessments, that then it's a no-brainer to implement. So you don't need to do absolutely everything that can possibly be done to turn your facility greener. If you can identify at least the items that are easy to do, that typically have a fairly big return, like fixing leaks, like in HVAC systems, for instance, using heat exchangers to do some heat recuperation, there's typically areas of very high inefficiency in technically simple areas of the building that can result in very big savings. And if you take care of those, then you've already made a big improvement, even if you can't implement absolutely everything that you would want to, because it then is not financially tenable for the owner of the plant.
Let's pivot to digitization. How can transitioning from paper-based data acquisition to digital improve efficiencies, sustainability, and ultimately profitability?
Yes, this would be a question that goes very nicely together with your previous one, in terms of something that you can do and you could arguably say is necessary to really understand even what is possible. So what are the options for you? Typically, facilities that rely on manual paper-based processes, they find a very high level of difficulty in then utilizing that information that is recorded on paper to discern patterns and opportunities for efficiency improvements. If the data is digitized and you have a database that then you're analyzing for such opportunities, then it is a much easier and much more conducive process for that. So whereas it's not really necessary or a prerequisite, so to speak, to be able to have digital operations in a facility, to be able to implement sustainability measures for a site, it helps a great deal because it makes understanding what the options are, what the possibilities are. Well, to start out with, it helps you understand what your baseline starting point is. And then, well, what is the potential improvement that you can undertake in a much clearer way? We as a company have a very high focus on this in enabling our customers to connect the different pieces of equipment that we supply to each other for the status information of that equipment, including the consumption of inputs, whether it's material or energy or whatever it may be, and the operational efficiencies of those pieces of equipment so that is highly visible and analyzable to our customers so that they can do something with that.
So I have to imagine that establishing a digital infrastructure is very different for a greenfield pharma new site build versus a brownfield project for a building that's already there, a manufacturer that's already established. What are some of those major differences between the shift to digitization between greenfield and brownfield projects?
Yes, you're speaking of an enormous difference because when you have a greenfield project, you are installing standard software packages that were designed ahead of time to fit together. When you're talking about upgrading a brownfield site, you're talking about highly customized software development that brings together the hodgepodge of software packages present at that site with that equipment. And a lot of sites, so starting with greenfield projects. So greenfield projects really have no reason not to, on this day and age, already start with a highly digitized plan for their plants. And indeed, that's what you see. All new plants going up are state of the art in that regard. Whereas very few brownfield projects are able to summon the investment needed because it is such a massive undertaking that companies really shy away from that. They basically just decide to plan out a particular obsolescence period for the site and then transfer production to a new, more efficient site down the line when they have really achieved the usability of the brownfield plant. But that is not to say that there isn't a middle solution. Again, it's in all of these, when we're talking about sustainability measurement, it's definitely not an all or nothing. There's definitely a lot that these brownfield sites still can do if they digitize only a portion of operations. For instance, HVAC systems, as I mentioned before, or some of the more critical process equipment, while leaving the rest manual. That alone can produce significant results with a lot less complexity because then you're integrating only a handful, perhaps, of different software packages as opposed to all the software packages that are at the site. But that is the situation for brownfield sites. I think it's more obsolescence management and see how much more useful life you can get out of that plant while you wait to move to a new highly efficient plant to meet demand in the future.
Now, earlier in our conversation, you mentioned recycling of materials and the creation of a circular pharma economy. How does pure media and water use come into play with this concept? Are there different considerations when planning for a reduction or reuse of water or media?
Yeah, so critical utilities is one of the more energy intensive aspects of operating a plant, and a fairly large part of the carbon footprint and also the cost footprint of the plant is related to pure media generation and distribution in the plant. And this is a question that comes up often. There is a fair bit that you can do, but it really depends on the specific situation for the customer. So how much water of what grade and at what temperature do you need in that facility? How many points of access do you need? For those sites that don't need hot WFI everywhere, there's quite a bit that you can do because you can think about running cold loops with ozone instead of hot loops everywhere. You can think about cold generation with just heating up at specific points of use where you might need hot WFI. And once you're operating at room temperature instead of 85 degrees C, your savings are massive. So you're talking about a 90 to 95% reduction in carbon emissions, for example, for a typical cold loop compared to a hot loop in a standard facility. So it is an order of magnitude difference. It's not 10%, 30%. It's a full order of magnitude difference. So sites can really think about their water needs, exactly what kind of water do they need where, including will purified water do instead of WFI, and does it need to be hot or cold? And if the answer is not always WFI, not always hot, then there's a fair bit that can be done. Recyclability of water is also possible, but you have to bear in mind that these are GMP environments, okay, good manufacturing practice environments that are heavily regulated, and you can't compromise the integrity of meeting regulatory requirements for the water at each point of use for its intended use. So you can use, for instance, recycled WFI for some pre-cleaning activities without compromising anything, as long as it's as that recycling is properly validated. But the scope is not unlimited. You would not be able typically to use recycled water, even WFI, for a pure grade unit operation that really warrants that from a regulatory perspective. So you're talking then about simply treatment of the water and then treating the effluent of the site.
So this conversation has really inspired me. I hope it's inspired our listeners. My question is there a right or a wrong time to address sustainability in pharma manufacturing? I'm sure the gears are spinning in a lot of our listeners' heads. What's the right time? Is there a wrong time? Maybe there is no wrong time. Fill me in.
I would say there's never a wrong time to try to do something. However, we of course live in an environment, so to speak, that really is impacted by the economic climate. So the appetite and the ability for companies to make certain investments really depend on the economic cycle and the financial cycle. I would say what you should not wait for is to understand what are the possibilities at your plant. So that I hope I've been able to communicate that is a lot more straightforward than you might think. It is not very time or resource intensive to really do a study on your facility to see what are the potential projects that you could be taking on to improve the profile of your plant. And then when you decide to request funding and to pursue those projects internally, there I would say that is maybe what's up for debate on when might the right timing be from an economic perspective and also a political perspective. But in the last few years, economic difficulties aside, in the last 4 or 5 years, with all the different things that have happened around the world, topic sustainability and social and environmental responsibility is very hot. It's something that is very high up in the priority list of most companies, most industries, not just pharma. And now is the time to stay on top of the situation and use this momentum to try to make significant progress, because it was not the case 10, 15 years ago. We're really riding a wave now of sustainability really being on the front burner for a lot of customers.
Well, Christian, what is our company, Syntagon, doing to address sustainability?
So Syntegon is an interesting example because apart from just being a part of being a company, the products that we make actually open up a few additional opportunities for improvement. So just by being a company and wanting to do the right thing, of course, Syntegon has a ESG program where we're trying to move as fast as possible in implementing measures to make our organization as sustainable as possible. And there's just as ESG is a standard way to organize ourselves in what we want to do in a corporate setting in terms of sustainability, there's also standardized rating systems to try to measure how well companies are doing. And a very popular rating system is run by a company called EcoVadis. And just like Olympic medals, there's bronze, silver, gold levels. And we proudly were able to achieve silver level already last year and are working towards trying to achieve gold certification this year. That means, so what does gold mean? It means that we are going way beyond our own direct emissions from our own operations, and we're looking at sub-suppliers or our supply chains to see how we can work together to minimize the entire life cycle contribution of our operations. So from our suppliers and then the downstream processing, how our customer use our equipment, we're already tackling that. From a machinery supplier perspective, our responsibility that we have is in understanding, well, what is the sustainability profile of the own equipment of our own equipment that we manufacture. So how carbon intensive is making the piece of equipment? How carbon intensive is putting it to use? How carbon intensive is it to recycle the piece of equipment? So we have a very extensive program where for our entire portfolio, we're working one by one to try to capture that in a professional, thorough way so that we can share that with our customers. And last but not least, because we're a packaging company as well, we are investing heavily in trying to see what type of development we can do on the material front to use more environmentally friendly packaging material for our machines. Material that is lighter, thinner, that requires much less inputs, and then also material that is recyclable or entirely biodegradable. So those are the three fronts that we are trying to advance sustainability on as a company, become a better corporate citizen with ESG, really understand our machines and fully characterize our machines for our customers so that they can make very good decisions when they buy equipment from us. And then also trying to push the envelope on innovation with the packaging material itself that runs on our machines.
Proud to be a Syntagon employee and glad that our company is making such strides. So that was a very important, heavy topic. Let's switch gears a little bit and have a little bit of fun. Here at Machines in Medicine, we like to end with a trivia question, one for me to you, Christian, and then hopefully from you to me. Not only is it fun, we also get to learn a little bit of something. So, okay. Christian, I know you're a trivia expert, so I had to really search far and wide for something that I think might be able to get you here, something that's not so easily answered. So my question to you is, what is a duel between three people called? What is a duel between three people called? You may not Google.
Well, and you have succeeded in getting me because I definitely don't know it off the top of my head. Okay, a duel of three people. Through just.
That is almost right.
Okay.
It's a truel. A truel is a duel between three people.
Excellent.
So
all right.
Now
maybe I get a partial credit on that one.
Sure. I'll give you that. So do you have anything for me? I have a feeling
I do.
I won't know it, but here we go.
I thought, well, how, can I find something that maybe has a little bit to do with you? So that's okay. The one hint. That's the one hint that you're going to get. Okay. So here it goes. Which highly intelligent animal not only segregates its waste, but also has been observed, particularly on sunny mornings in winter, to take their bedding outside to air out before retrieving it again later in the day?
Oh, this has some. Oh, well, let's see. I'm going to shoot from the hip. Is this a badger?
That is correct.
All right. And your clue really helped me. For the listeners, I went to the University of Wisconsin in Madison for graduate school, and we were the Badgers. Christian and I, we go way back, so he knew this about me. I hope you guys all now learned that badgers are very clean animals. So very good. They like to air out their bedding.
Intelligent and sustainable animals. There you have it.
Wonderful. Well, what a great way to wrap up the podcast. I'd like to thank you, Christian Lavarreda, for bringing the knowledge today. I know I gained a lot from our conversation, and I'm sure that our audience did too. So sustainability is a huge topic with many different facets and intricacies, but in the end, sustainability means many things to many people, but it's vital. It's really important for all of us as a human race. what better way to move forward with our goals than by talking about it? So I'm so happy that we got to talk today with Christian. I'd also like to thank our listeners, and I look forward to discovering more with you in the next episode of Machines and Medicine. Be well. Bye-bye.